Okay, so at this point, if you're watching this video, you've completed your annotated bibliography worksheet. That was a lot of work. Good job. Now, a big part of this whole research process is now over. You've looked at what the research said. Now it's time to figure out what to do with that information. And you probably have a pretty good idea. You probably had a pretty good idea even before you started. And hopefully now, as you can see the big picture, you can see all that information that you've collected. It's time to start figuring out, okay, what does this mean? How can I use this information to present a solution to the problem? Okay, so let's talk a little bit about the concept of a solution and how it relates to research. In just a regular essay, when we're using argumentation, which you would have studied in English 101, we're typically pretty quick to use uh, bold terms like this proves this or this whatever, right? But in science, and I know this is an English class, but when we're trying to be very careful with our words, in science, it's almost impossible to prove anything because you have to control every possible variable to prove something. And probably the research topic that you've chosen, it is impossible to control every single variable. So to prove causation, prove that if you do this, this will solve this, is really, really difficult to do, especially if you're dealing with people. People are complicated. We have so many things going on. It's hard to prove anything, right? And that's why many topics that we want to research, that we want to find solutions for, go unsolved because people aren't perfect. People are stuck in their ways. They don't want to change their minds. And what may seem like an easy solution is probably not an easy solution. Okay? So, we need to be careful not to use words like this proves this. Instead, we need to qualify our statements by saying something like the research suggests, if you do A, then B will happen. Something like that. By being careful with how we phrase things, we never, we avoid logical fallacies, right? By overstating what we're able to explain or justify in our paper. Now, in a research essay, um, we need to be a little more careful than just any essay where we're trying to argue our side to something. Because we're using research, it is very appropriate for us to be more precise, to qualify our statements. In English 101, if you studied the Tolman method, then you would have learned the importance of qualifier in a statement. This is how we make our argument very specific, and we make sure we don't commit a logical fallacy by overstating the uh, the strength of our argument. Okay, so if you're trying to provide a solution, um, don't say this. Don't overpromise anything, because then you've already made a mistake, right? People are involved. It's we have to account for the fallibility of humanity. Okay, the next thing you need to do, other than just being careful with how you phrase things, is look at what might actually help solve a problem. Okay, so let me throw out an example situation. During the pandemic, during COVID, there were a lot of different problems that teachers had to deal with when it came to um, teaching students from a distance, right? I was teaching high school at the time, and I had already earned a doctorate in e learning. I was already teaching my students Students were already completing assignments through Google Classroom. Like, they knew it. It wasn't new at all. But there were some problems that we immediately faced the second that students were no longer in the room with me and they were at home to do all this work. The biggest problems being many of my students didn't have a great internet connection. They didn't have a device that they could do their work on. They struggled to be motivated to do their work. And then, after dealing with those three big things, then they had to actually do the work, right? So those are four different variables on one specific problem. So if we want to find the most efficient way to teach online using Google Classroom, that's a specific thing I could argue. But I could create the world's greatest online course, and maybe I did. But it doesn't matter if my students can't connect, if they don't have an appropriate device to access the course, if they're not motivated to do the work. Those three situations right there also need to be dealt with in addition to creating a good course that could teach if students could engage with the content. Does that make sense? So let's say I want to solve that problem. It's not a matter of doing just one thing. It's doing like 4 different things. So that's just a hypothetical situation. But let's say I want to do a research paper and I want to solve that problem. Or maybe I want to be an armchair quarterback and say, all right, hindsight being 2020, how could we actually try to solve this problem? How could we have tried to solve this problem? These are the steps we could have taken. That would be something that could be in a research paper, sure. Or you could just be a little more specific and say, all right, these were some of the issues that we encountered during the pandemic. This would have helped solve one of those problems. And you could just be specific. You never have to address the entire problem. You just have to be clear which part of a problem you're going to talk about. We call this a statement of methodology. It's not something you need to know, but it's a thing. A statement of methodology is basically clarifying what you will talk about and what you won't talk about. Does that make sense? So if you're talking about a big issue and you're going to be specific, which is almost always a good idea, by being specific, you're saying, all right, I am aware of all these different other parts of the problem. I'm just going to talk about this part. Okay? Statement of methodology, something you would include probably in your introduction. You don't need to call it a statement of methodology. You can just say that in this research study, we focused on this and not this, right? Something to think about. But it helps make it easier to solve the problem because you're focusing on part of a problem, not everything, right? So one research essay saying like, okay, how am I going to solve providing internet to an entire school of students? That's a ginormous problem. How am I going to provide a device to an entire school of students? That's a big task. Now, how am I going to motivate an entire school of students? That's a ginormous task. And then there's the actual teaching part, right? Will we use synchronous learning? Will we use asynchronous learning? Are we going to require students to log in and watch videos or whatever, right? It's a very big problem. But maybe you're just like, okay, one of the most difficult things during the pandemic was providing students with dealing with student motivation. Let's say that's what you want to focus on, that part of the problem. So you can go find sources on what helps to motivate students. What were some of the mental health issues that students were dealing with during the pandemic? What was successful that people did? What was not successful? And what could have been done better? That seems like a full-fledged response to it, right? So if I want to present a solution to say, if this happens in the future, how can we deal with this? That's something you could argue. Is this making sense? I just want you to start to think like a researcher. And okay, how can I actually address this problem? And then you can look at what your research actually says that you went and you found. I asked you to go find 3 or 4 sources specifically on the solution part of, of the topic. So what did they say? What did they present? Do you like those ideas? Do you think they're, horrible ideas? And then you figure out how to use it appropriately within context, not taking your information out of context, and how can you present a solution. After you take the time and you think through this whole situation, then you're going to be better prepared for the rest of what we're going to do in Unit 2, which is then figure out what your thesis statement is going to be, which is your ultimate argument. Your thesis statement will be, how do we solve this problem? That's what it needs to be. Then you'll write an outline to kind of structure, take some of the information from your annotated bibliography, put it into a structure, and then you're going to start writing the introduction and the second section of your paper, which I'm calling the problem section, where you explain what the problem is using research. All right, that's a bit of an overview. The big things I want you to take away from this is, don't overpromise. As you get ready to write your thesis statement, don't overpromise. Look at what the research actually says. Maybe get very specific on which part of the problem you could focus on, and figure out, okay, based on the research, what can I be most successful at? And being specific, looking at what the research says, not trying to twist it to be something that it isn't, that's when you're going to be most successful. So I hope that this is helpful, and I'll see you in the next video.